Welcome to the Pardes channel. Today we explain Prophets Joshua chapter 11 in a clear and simple way, step by step. Imagine for a second looking out and seeing an enemy army so unbelievably massive that it literally looks like the sand on the seashore. We're talking cutting-edge weapons of ancient warfare, completely stacked against a lightly armed infantry. This chapter is absolutely incredible. It is the thrilling culmination of the Northern Campaign, and it features the highest stakes, most intimidating battle in the entire book. We're going to walk right through the Hebrew text exactly as it unfolds.
Here's how we're going to break down this explainer today. 1. Context and the northern threat. 2. Victory at the waters of Merom. 3. Capturing Hazor and beyond. 4. Defeating the Anakites. 5. Explanations and key ideas. And finally, 6. Practical life lessons.
All right, let's jump right into Section 1, Context and the Northern Threat, the Gathering Storm. To really set the scene for verses 1 through 5, we've got to understand the unprecedented danger gathering up north. Israel just secured the southern territories, but the north, that is a completely different, heavily armed beast.
So we kick things off in verse 1 by meeting a guy named Jabin, the king of Hazor. Now Jabin has been hearing all about Joshua's sweeping victories down south, and realizing that his kingdom is absolutely next in line, Jabin doesn't just sit around waiting to be attacked. He takes the initiative to rally this massive, unified coalition to wipe out Israel before they can advance a single step further into northern territory. He sends urgent word out to Jobab, king of Madon, to the kings of Shimron and Akshaph, basically pulling every single regional leader into one gigantic military pact.
Verses 2 and 3 really show us the sheer mind-boggling scale of this alliance. It stretches all the way from the Arabah, south of Kinnereth, deep into the hill country. We are talking about the Canaanites in the east and the west, the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites up in the hills, and the Hivites below Mount Hermon in the Mizpah region. It's a total, unprecedented mobilization. Every remaining regional power is uniting into one single, massive front against Israel.
Now, you might be wondering, why was Jabin the one calling all the shots? Why did these other kings even listen to him? Well, we have to clarify that Hazor wasn't just some random town on the map. It was the bustling, wealthy capital of the entire region. That's why Jabin had the unique political and military authority to summon all these distinct and normally independent tribes. As the text explicitly tells us a bit later, Hazor had historically been the head of all these enemy kingdoms.
And the text in verses 4 and 5 literally describes this combined force camping out together at the waters of Merom as an endless sea of soldiers. They are described as a huge army, as numerous as the sand on the seashore. But, it wasn't just their numbers that made them terrifying. It was their gear. They were armed with a huge number of horses and chariots. For the Israelites, who were mostly just infantry fighting on foot, facing the high-speed, advanced military tech of chariots in an open battle, that was a seemingly impossible, deeply terrifying threat.
Moving right along to Section 2, Victory at the waters of Merom, a sudden strike. Let's see how Israel actually confronts this overwhelming force at the climax of the battle, in verses 6 through 9.
The absolute turning point hits right in verse 6. Looking at this overwhelming, technologically superior horde, God speaks directly to Joshua with a comforting yet wildly bold promise. He says, "Do not be afraid of them, because by this time tomorrow I will hand all of them over to Israel slain." God is promising a complete, miraculous victory within a mere 24 hours. Given the massive scale of that enemy coalition, a total defeat in a single day completely defies all human military logic. So what does Joshua do? In verses 7 and 8, we see his immediate tactical response. He doesn't cower, and he certainly doesn't wait to be attacked. Instead, he launches a sudden, surprise offensive right at the waters of Merom. He catches the coalition totally off guard, before they can even fully deploy their chariots, and the strike works perfectly. The Lord gives them into the hand of Israel. They completely rout this massive coalition and pursue the fleeing armies relentlessly over immense distances, all the way to Greater Sidon, to Misrephoth-Maim, and to the valley of Mizpah on the east, until the threat is entirely neutralized, and no survivors are left to regroup.
Then, in verse 9, we get a really specific, kind of surprising detail. After the battle, Joshua follows God's strict command to hamstring the horses and burn the chariots. Hamstringing basically means cutting the tendon of the animal's leg so it's permanently disabled and can never be used to pull a war chariot again. Now, you might be thinking, why on earth would Joshua destroy these powerful weapons instead of keeping them to upgrade his own army?
Well, the simple meaning here is that this ensured Israel relied purely on God's power, rather than adopting advanced Canaanite weaponry and putting their future faith in military hardware.
Which brings us to Section 3, capturing Hazor and beyond, fulfilling the command. Let's look at verses 10 through 15 and see how this initial battlefield victory transitions into the systematic conquest of the region's capital.
Looking at verses 10 and 11, we see the immediate aftermath. Joshua circles back to capture Hazor itself. He executes its king with the sword and entirely burns the city to the ground. The text here is unflinching. It plainly states they totally destroyed everything that breathed, leaving literally nothing alive. Because Hazor was the undisputed head of those enemy kingdoms, its complete fiery destruction sent a definitive, unignorable message across the entire land that the Northern Coalition's power was permanently broken.
But verses 12 through 14 give us a really fascinating geographical contrast. While Hazor was reduced completely to ashes, the other royal cities, the ones built up on defensive mounds or tells, were actually spared from the fire. Joshua captured their kings and struck them down to remove their leadership, sure, but the Israelites were explicitly allowed to take the plunder and the livestock of these other mound cities for themselves. This was super practical. It provided the Israelites with the necessary resources, food, and wealth to actually survive and sustain their community in this new territory.
The narrative actually takes a deliberate pause in verse 15 to hit home a crucial point about obedience. It makes it crystal clear that this entire campaign of destruction was an exact fulfillment of the divine chain of command. As the Lord commanded his servant Moses, so Moses commanded Joshua, and Joshua did it. The text states plainly that Joshua left nothing undone of all that the Lord commanded Moses. His adherence to the instructions he was given was absolute, down to the letter.
All right, Section 4, defeating the Anakites, mopping up the giants. In this section, we're focusing on verses 16 through 22, which detail the long war and the final defeat of Israel's most feared historical enemies.
Verses 16 through 18 lay out the sheer scope of the land Israel took. Joshua's campaign secured a vast amount of territory, from Mount Halak rising towards Seir in the deep south, all the way up to Ba'ad Gad in the valley of Lebanon below Mount Hermon in the far north. But verse 18 includes a critical little detail. It notes that Joshua waged war against all these kings for a long time. This clarifies that while that initial battle at Merom was lightning fast, the overall pacification of the region was a grueling, sustained campaign that required immense physical and mental endurance over a period of many years.
Now, reading verse 19, you gotta wonder, why didn't any of these northern cities just wave the white flag and surrender to spare themselves when they saw what was coming? Well, verse 20 answers that directly. It explains that God himself hardened the hearts of these kings to stubbornly wage war against Israel. This ensured they would meet Israel in battle and be totally destroyed without mercy, perfectly fulfilling the severe mandate the Lord had originally given to Moses regarding these specific nations. The only exception, of course, was the Hivites living in Gibeon, who had already tricked Israel into a binding peace treaty earlier on.
And then in verses 21 and 22, we get this incredibly satisfying historical payoff. You see, the Anakites were a race of terrifying giants. 40 years earlier, out in the wilderness, just the rumor of these giants had caused an entire generation of Israelites to completely lose their faith and refuse to enter the land. But here, we see Joshua decisively destroying them from the hill country, from Hebron and from Debir, leaving absolutely no Anakites in Israelite territory. The text notes that only a handful of survivors remained, completely isolated on the coastal plains in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod.
That brings us to Section 5. Explanations and key ideas. The simple meaning. As we unpack verse 23, let's distill the key takeaways from the simple, literal meaning of everything we've covered today.
Verse 23 just beautifully wraps up the major military conquests. Joshua took the entire land exactly as the Lord had directed Moses, and he handed it over as an inheritance to the tribes of Israel according to their tribal divisions. And finally, the text declares this profound and hard-earned reality. Then the land had rest from war. That prolonged, exhausting period of intense, blood-soaked warfare and struggle finally came to a peaceful, stable end.
So what's the core takeaway here? The fundamental message of this entire chapter is that Israel's success literally had nothing to do with their numbers. And it wasn't because of military superiority against advanced chariots either. It was entirely dependent on their strict, unwavering obedience to the Lord's commands. Joshua leaving nothing undone was the ultimate key. Earthly victories here stem directly from trusting in divine promises, even when the opposing odds look as innumerable as the sand on the seashore.
Let's bring it all home in Section 6, Practical Life Lessons Applying Joshua 11. How do these ancient historical events give us practical life lessons for our own self-improvement today?
Let's quickly recap. Joshua faced an unimaginably massive northern coalition, struck them suddenly with God's reassurance, systematically destroyed Hazor while leaving other cities intact, and wiped out the terrifying Anakites, ultimately bringing a hard-fought rest to the land. So what do we learn? First, even when you're facing deeply ingrained fears, your own personal chariots, you can confront them without fear when you trust you are supported. Second, just like Joshua, who left nothing undone, executing our responsibilities thoroughly and completely is crucial. And finally, you absolutely must confront the long-standing giants, the Anakites in your life that you've been avoiding. Defeating those specific, intimidating obstacles is what ultimately leads to genuine peace and rest in your own life.
So, I want to leave you with this thought to reflect on. What fearsome Anakites are standing in the way of your own land having rest? Thank you for learning with us. If this helped you understand the chapter better, like, subscribe, and join us for the next chapter.